The Zarin dominion descended upon Earth with the cold efficiency of a species that had long since forgotten the sting of defeat. They had subjugated worlds far more advanced than this one, using their plasma-based weaponry and AI-driven combat systems to crush opposition effortlessly. Each planet had fallen with the same predictability: resistance in the beginning, followed by collapse as soon as their forces overwhelmed the enemy's defenses. Earth, to them, was just another conquest. Zarin history was steeped in conquest. Their species thrived on war, using towering exosuits that could devastate entire battalions with a single blow. They relied on brute strength coupled with their advanced technology, having no need for subtlety. Their plasma rifles could disintegrate organic matter on contact, and their drone swarms patrolled the skies, hunting any foolish enough to oppose them. In the grand scope of the galaxy, humans were seen as primitive, a species still dependent on metal projectiles and chemical-based firearms, like relics from a forgotten era. The Zarkans, amused by Earth's outdated military technology, mocked humanity. Projectile-based weapons? They scoffed at the idea that humans still used bullets. To them, snipers and their rifles were laughable, relics of a bygone era when precision was valued over sheer firepower. They couldn't fathom that any human could be a threat. Their shields were impervious to these primitive attacks, or so they believed. Arrogance consumed the Zarin Empire, just as it had with every other conquest. But Earth's defenders were not without hope, despite the odds. Humanity, while technologically inferior, was not a species to surrender easily. World governments, for the first time in decades, united in the face of the alien onslaught. They understood their limitations but also knew the power of strategy. They would not meet the Zarkans head-on in traditional warfare. That path led to certain defeat. Instead, they focused on unconventional methods, special operations, guerrilla tactics, and stealth. Earth's armies had crumbled in the first wave of attacks. The initial clashes were catastrophic. Tanks, fighter jets, and missile silos were obliterated by the Zarkans' superior firepower. In the face of such overwhelming force, the resistance seemed futile. Cities were reduced to rubble, and Earth's most advanced weaponry barely scratched the surface of the aliens' defenses. The early defeats were demoralizing, and the Zarkans only grew bolder, setting up forward bases on Earth's soil, preparing for the inevitable surrender. But even as the world's leaders despaired, small groups of soldiers and civilians fought on. Among them was Sergeant David Reynolds. David had seen more combat than most, serving as an elite sniper in the Earth resistance. He wasn't just skilled, he was patient, methodical. Where others saw failure, he saw opportunity. The Zarkans may have had superior technology, but David knew that no shield was perfect, no armor impenetrable if you knew where to strike. David had been trained for this. For years he honed his craft, learning the art of long-range marksmanship and the importance of terrain. In the forests and mountains, where the Zarkans' technology had trouble tracking organic signatures, David became a ghost. He was an expert in camouflage, able to blend into the environment and disappear entirely, waiting for the perfect moment to take a shot. He had learned early on that patience was a sniper's greatest weapon. As David prepared for the mission, he reflected on his journey. He wasn't the strongest soldier or the fastest, but he had a mind for strategy. While others rushed into combat, seeking glory, he waited. The world had collapsed around him, but in that chaos, David had found clarity. His rifle was a simple tool, but in his hands, it became something far deadlier than any alien plasma gun. The Zarkans, in their arrogance, had overlooked Earth's natural defenses. They set up their bases in open fields, confident that no human weapon could touch them. The towering exosuits that guarded the perimeter were almost comical in their size, designed to intimidate and crush any opposition. But in their size, David saw weakness. Those suits were designed for direct combat, not precision. The aliens weren't looking for one man in the distance, a man with a rifle and a plan. The alien commander was a particularly smug figure. From his high vantage point, he barked orders at his subordinates, completely unaware that David had been watching him for hours. The Zarkans had become careless, assuming that humanity's resistance had been crushed. The commander stood tall in his shining armor, a symbol of Zarkin's superiority. But to David, he was just a target. Positioned in the dense forest, miles away from the Zarkin camp, David lay prone on the ground, his rifle nestled against his shoulder. The scope glinted faintly in the sunlight, but he knew the aliens wouldn't notice. They weren't looking for him. They thought themselves invincible, beyond the reach of Earth's so-called primitive weapons. David adjusted his aim, calculating the distance, wind speed, and the movement of the commander. His breathing slowed as he settled into the familiar rhythm of the hunt. The Zarkin commander raised his hand, signaling to his troops. That would be his last movement. David's finger tightened on the trigger, and the shot rang out. To the Zarkins, it was almost silent, just a faint crack, like the snapping of a twig. But in an instant, the commander's body jerked, his helmet snapping back as a hole appeared right in the center of his forehead. The commander crumpled to the ground. For a moment, the Zarkins froze, unsure of what had just happened. There was no explosion, no flash of plasma fire. Just a simple bullet, fired from a rifle they had mocked. Panic rippled through the alien ranks. Their shields hadn't stopped the shot. Their armor hadn't deflected it. A single human, with a weapon they considered obsolete, had killed their leader. David didn't wait to see the aftermath. He was already moving, slipping into the shadows of the trees, disappearing as easily as he had appeared. The Zarkins scrambled, sending drones into the forest to locate the sniper, but it was too late. David was gone, a ghost among the trees. They had underestimated humanity, and now they were paying the price. As David retreated to safety, he knew this was only the beginning. The Zarkins would come for him, but they had already lost their advantage. They had underestimated Earth's resolve, its soldiers, and the deadliness of a well-placed shot. And now they would learn the hard way that humanity's strength wasn't in its technology, but in its spirit, the will to fight, to adapt, and to survive against impossible odds. And David Reynolds, the sniper they had laughed at, was about to teach them a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. David lay prone in the thick underbrush, a mile from the alien outpost, his rifle resting perfectly against his shoulder. He had been in this position for days, watching the Zarkin commander's every move through his scope. Patience was something David had mastered over years of training, and now it was paying off. Every day, the commander followed the same pattern, walking the perimeter, barking orders at his subordinates, and then retreating to a vantage point overlooking the entire camp. Arrogant. Predictable. David knew the shot would have to be perfect. The Zarkins were still oblivious to the real threat humanity posed. To them, the idea that a human sniper could hit one of their commanders, let alone kill him, was laughable. They believed their shields were impenetrable, their technology too advanced for any Earth-based weapon to be a threat. But David knew better. He wasn't relying on technology. He relied on his skill, his patience, and the fact that the Zarkins, despite all their advancements, had overlooked one simple truth: no shield was perfect. The wind was calm today, which was a rare gift. David adjusted his scope, accounting for the distance and the slight angle from his position. His breathing slowed, each exhale syncing with the stillness around him. It wasn't just about pulling the trigger, it was about timing. He had to fire when no one was watching, when the camp's attention was elsewhere, and when the commander was completely exposed. Through the scope, he watched as the commander moved into position. His large, armored form stood at the edge of a cliff that overlooked the entire Zarkin base. From there, the commander could see everything. But what he didn't realize was that it also made him a perfect target. David's crosshairs followed the alien's every step, his mind running through every possible scenario. There would only be one shot. And it had to count. David's finger hovered over the trigger. The commander stopped, turning to bark orders at his troops below. This was it. The moment. David squeezed the trigger slowly, feeling the slight recoil of the rifle against his shoulder. The sound of the shot was barely audible, just a faint crack that blended into the background noise of the forest. The bullet cut through the air, traveling the distance between David and his target in less than a second. The Zarkin commander's head snapped back as the bullet found its mark. A small hole appeared in the center of his helmet, right between his glowing red eyes. For a split second, the alien's body remained rigid, as if his brain hadn't yet registered the fact that he was dead. Then, with a sudden lurch, the commander crumpled to the ground, his body sliding off the cliff and disappearing into the chaos below. For a moment, the entire camp seemed to freeze. The Zarkan soldiers, always so confident, stood still, unsure of what had just happened. They looked around in confusion, their eyes scanning the sky as if expecting some great human weapon to reveal itself. But there was nothing. No plasma explosion, no drone strike, just a single, precise bullet that had taken down their leader. Panic spread quickly. The Zarkan troops scrambled, their movements frantic as they tried to understand how this had happened. Their shields were supposed to be impenetrable, their armor strong enough to withstand anything humanity could throw at them. But here they were, their commander dead from a single shot fired by a human weapon they had dismissed as primitive. Their overconfidence had blinded them, and now they were paying the price. The tension in the camp was palpable. The Zarkan soldiers barked orders at each other in their guttural language, trying to locate the source of the shot. Drones were launched into the sky, scanning the forest below for any sign of movement. But David was long gone. He had fired the shot and immediately retreated, blending into the dense trees and undergrowth, as if he had never been there at all. This was his terrain, his battlefield. The Zarkans might have the technology, but David had something far more valuable: experience and the ability to disappear. As the drones buzzed overhead scanning the area where the shot had been fired, they found nothing. David had been meticulous in covering his tracks, setting up decoys and false trails to mislead any pursuers. He had trained for this, hours spent perfecting the art of disappearing into the landscape. The Zarkans, despite all their technological superiority, were ill-equipped to deal with guerrilla tactics. They were used to overwhelming their enemies with brute force, not dealing with a lone sniper who could strike and vanish before they even knew what had happened. The camp was in chaos. Without their commander, the soldiers were leaderless, unsure of how to proceed. The drones continued their fruitless search, and the remaining officers began shouting orders to form defensive positions. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. The message was clear: humanity wasn't as weak as they had thought, and the war they had expected to win so easily was far from over. David moved swiftly through the forest, sticking to the shadows as the sounds of the Zarkan camp grew fainter behind him. He knew they would send teams to find him, but he had already prepared for that. Traps had been set along the path he had taken, and the Zarkans, unfamiliar with Earth's terrain, would be easy prey if they followed too closely. As he moved further away, David's mind was already on the next target. This was just the beginning. The Zarkans might have had the upper hand in the early stages of the war, but now, they were beginning to realize that their technological advantage wasn't enough to guarantee victory. David had shown them that humanity could strike from the shadows, that even the most advanced shields and armor couldn't protect them from a well-placed bullet. He had shifted the balance, if only for a moment, and now the Zarkans would be on edge, always looking over their shoulders, always wondering where the next shot would come from. As he reached his next safe zone, hidden deep within a ravine, David allowed himself a moment to breathe. The first shot had been a success. The Zarkans were shaken, their confidence in tatters, and that gave the Earth resistance a sliver of hope. But David knew this was far from over. The Zarkans would regroup, and they would come after him with everything they had. But David was ready for them. He had studied them, understood their weaknesses, and now they would pay for underestimating him. David had become more than just a soldier in the eyes of the Zarkan invaders. He was a ghost, an ever-present threat that haunted their every move. Each day, as the alien forces moved through Earth's desolate cities and forests, they found themselves under the crosshairs of a sniper they could never see. David had made the decision to stay on the move, never staying in one location for too long. He understood that his mobility was his greatest weapon. The Zarkans were looking for a traditional fight, but he wasn't going to give them that. His tactics were simple but effective. He knew that the Zarkans relied heavily on their technology to communicate and coordinate their operations, so he targeted their communication officers. It was always the same routine. He would track a convoy, wait for the right moment, and then strike. One shot, one kill. The Zarin officers never saw it coming. His ability to vanish after each shot left the Zarkins in disarray, and their supply convoys became sitting ducks. In time, they grew hesitant to travel in anything less than massive numbers, but even then, David found ways to strike. In the cover of darkness, he would move to high ground, sometimes spending hours in the same position just waiting for the perfect opportunity. The Zarkins had no idea how to handle it. Their forces, once so confident, were now growing more erratic, unsure of how to defend themselves against an enemy they couldn't find. David exploited their fear. He didn't need to kill hundreds to make an impact. He just needed to keep them guessing, to make them question every move they made. The Zarin leadership, frustrated and angry, responded by sending out drones, hundreds of them, each equipped with advanced thermal imaging sensors, designed to locate heat signatures in the dense forests and mountainous regions where David operated. But he had anticipated this. Using old military tactics, he masked his heat signature, employing basic but effective techniques: mud, thermal blankets, and the natural cold of the environment itself. The drones flew overhead, searching for him relentlessly, but each time they came up empty. David understood the terrain better than the Zarkins ever would. He used it to his advantage, slipping through natural valleys and dense woods, always staying one step ahead. When he wasn't shooting, he was setting traps. Tripwires, decoys, anything that could slow down the enemy and make them second-guess their every move. The Zarkins were becoming desperate, and David knew it. Their technology was sophisticated, but they were struggling to adapt to the realities of guerrilla warfare. They were used to overwhelming their enemies with superior firepower and numbers, but David had reduced their advantage to almost nothing. At the Earth Resistance base, news of David's success began to spread. The Resistance fighters had been demoralized in the early days of the invasion, watching helplessly as the Zarkins dismantled Earth's defenses. But now they had hope. David's success inspired them, showing that the fight wasn't over. Word of his exploits spread quickly among the soldiers, each story more legendary than the last. They began to believe that, despite their outdated weapons, they could still win. Morale started to rise. David's lone mission was slowly shifting the tide of war. It wasn't just the physical toll he was taking on the Zarin forces, it was the psychological damage. Every time he struck, the Zarkins grew more paranoid. They couldn't understand how one man with a rifle could have such a devastating impact. Their frustration mounted as they realized their advanced technology wasn't enough to guarantee victory. They needed something more, something they hadn't prepared for. The Zarin commanders grew desperate. They began to shift strategies, resorting to extreme measures. They ordered indiscriminate bombing runs over vast stretches of land, hoping to flush David out. Entire areas were obliterated, reduced to smoldering craters in a futile attempt to catch one sniper. But David had already moved on, watching from afar as the Zarkins wasted their resources. Every bomb they dropped further weakened their resolve. Every failed search operation demoralized their troops. David understood that this was his real weapon, not just his rifle, but the fear he instilled in the Zarkins. They had come to Earth expecting an easy victory, but now they were questioning everything. They didn't know where the next attack would come from, and that uncertainty was starting to eat away at them. The Zarin soldiers, once so bold, now hesitated to leave their bases. They moved in large, clumsy groups, always looking over their shoulders, always expecting another shot. The fear of the unseen sniper made them slow, and in their fear, they made mistakes. David capitalized on every one of them, striking at the weak points of their armor, their convoys, and their communication lines. For the first time since the invasion began, the Zarin forces were on the defensive. Their towering exosuits and plasma rifles were no longer the tools of invincibility they had once seemed to be. They were vulnerable, and they knew it. Each day, David's guerrilla campaign eroded their confidence, and with each passing week, the Zarin Empire's grip on Earth weakened. David never let up. He kept moving, kept shooting, always staying one step ahead. The Zarkans tried every trick they had, deploying more drones, sending out elite hunter squads, even attempting to bait him with false convoys. But David was smarter. He had lived through enough battles to know when a trap was being set. He avoided the obvious, focusing instead on picking off the high-value targets that mattered most, the officers who kept the Zarkan war machine running. The more David struck, the more desperate the Zarkans became. In their desperation, they began making mistakes, and each mistake cost them dearly. Supplies ran low, morale dropped, and the once invincible Zarkan forces found themselves in an unfamiliar position, losing. They had underestimated humanity's resolve, and now they were paying the price. David's war was far from over, but the balance had shifted. The Zarkans were no longer the unstoppable force they once believed themselves to be. Now they were the ones looking over their shoulders, wondering when the next shot would come, wondering how one man had turned the tide of an entire invasion. And David, ever the sniper, remained patient, knowing that every day he remained unseen was another victory. The Zarkans were learning the hard way that on Earth, even the smallest spark of resistance could ignite a fire that would burn through the mightiest of empires. The Zarkan High Command, shaken by the constant loss of key officers and critical supplies, had no choice but to send in their most formidable warrior. General Koroth, known throughout the galaxy for his brutality and unmatched combat prowess, was dispatched to Earth with a single mission: eliminate the human sniper. Koroth had led countless conquests, toppling entire civilizations, and he took particular pride in doing so with overwhelming force. His armor was a marvel of Zarkan engineering, an impenetrable fortress of alien alloys, shielding him from any known weapon. He believed Earth would fall just like the rest, swiftly and without resistance. Upon landing, Koroth exuded the same arrogance that had defined the Zarkan Empire's approach from the start. He moved through the camp, inspecting his troops, issuing orders with a chilling calm. His towering figure, clad in dark armor that gleamed under the alien sky, was meant to be a symbol of inevitable victory. To him, this sniper was nothing more than a nuisance, a relic of a planet that should have already surrendered. He thought it laughable that a human with such primitive tools had managed to disrupt their operations. But this time, he put an end to it personally. David knew Koroth was coming. He had intercepted Zarkan communications and gathered enough intelligence to understand what was at stake. This wasn't just another officer. Koroth was different, smarter, more prepared, and more dangerous than anyone David had faced. His armor was layered with energy shields, and he had a reputation for crushing enemies with ruthless efficiency. David had already seen how the Zarkans adapted to his tactics, sending drones and setting traps to catch him. This time, he would have to be even more precise. David spent days studying Koroth's movements from a distance, taking notes on how the general interacted with his troops, where he positioned himself, and when he seemed most vulnerable. Patience had always been David's greatest weapon, and now he would need it more than ever. Every detail mattered. The position of the sun, the direction of the wind, the reflective glint off the general's armor. David considered them all as he planned his shot. He couldn't afford to miss, not this time. If Koroth wasn't killed in one shot, David knew there wouldn't be a second chance. The day of the confrontation came. Koroth had made the mistake of setting up his command center in an exposed position, believing no human weapon could touch him. His confidence would be his undoing. David lay hidden in the underbrush, his rifle resting on the ground. Through the scope, he watched as Koroth moved around the camp, barking orders, completely unaware that his every step was being tracked. David's finger hovered near the trigger, his mind racing through the hundreds of variables that could affect the shot. It wasn't just about pulling the trigger, it was about timing, precision, and the perfect opportunity. Koroth, for all his arrogance, had a flaw that David had noticed in earlier engagements. His armor, while nearly impenetrable, had a small vulnerability at the neck joint. It was a fraction of an inch, a weakness so minute that most wouldn't even notice it. But David had. That was where the bullet would go. He steadied his breathing, every muscle in his body completely still, waiting for the moment when Koroth would be fully exposed. Then it happened. Koroth stopped mid-command, turning his head slightly to the side, revealing the weak spot David had been waiting for. Without hesitation, David squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, a sound that would forever be etched into the memory of every Zarkan soldier who witnessed it. The bullet cut through the air, fast and silent, finding its mark with perfect accuracy. Koroth's body stiffened as the bullet struck the small gap in his armor. His hands instinctively reached for his neck, as if trying to grasp the invisible force that had just penetrated his seemingly indestructible defense. For a moment, the entire camp stood still, paralyzed by the sight of their fearless general stumbling backward. The mighty Koroth, the warrior who had never known defeat, was falling. His armored body hit the ground with a deafening thud, the impact shaking the ground beneath him. The Zarkans watched in disbelief, unable to process what had just occurred. Panic set in immediately. With their leader dead, the alien forces descended into chaos. The once organized Zarkan troops broke ranks, unsure of what to do without Koroth's iron command. They scrambled to find the sniper, launching drones and sending scouting parties into the wilderness. But David was already gone, having disappeared into the forest like a shadow. The camp erupted in disarray, officers shouting conflicting orders, soldiers retreating, and drones circling aimlessly above. Back at the Earth Resistance base, news of Koroth's death spread like wildfire. The general's demise was more than just a victory, it was a turning point in the war. The Zarkan forces had been crippled by the loss of their most feared leader, and without his command, they were left vulnerable and disorganized. David's single shot had done more than any battle could have. It shattered the Zarkan Empire's belief in their own invincibility. Humanity had won, not through superior firepower or advanced technology, but through the resilience, patience, and skill of one sniper. The tide of the war shifted. Zarkan forces, no longer confident in their inevitable victory, began retreating from key positions. What had once seemed like a hopeless fight was now a war that could be won. The Earth Resistance seized the opportunity, launching coordinated strikes against the remaining Zarkan forces, driving them back from city to city. David, watching from a distance as the Zarkan ships began leaving Earth's atmosphere, reflected on the cost of the war. The battle was far from over, and he knew the Zarkans would return, perhaps with more brutal tactics or more advanced weaponry. But for now, humanity had bought itself time. Time to regroup, rebuild, and prepare for whatever came next. As he packed his gear and prepared to move on to the next mission, David knew that the Zarkans, who had once mocked Earth's primitive weapons, had learned a harsh lesson. The true strength of humanity wasn't in its technology, but in its ability to adapt, endure, and fight against all odds. And in that moment, the invaders who had underestimated Earth realized they were facing a species far more formidable than they had ever imagined.